Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Francesca Luberti. She has recently completed a PhD at the School of Biological, Earth and Environmental Sciences, UNSW, Sydney. She is now doing a postdoc in the Neuroendocrinology lab at Nipissing University in Canada. She does research in evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, social psychology, and biological anthropology. And today we're going to focus mostly on the relationship between preferred mating strategies and social political orientation, and we're going to talk also a little bit about laughter toward the end. So, Dr. Luberti, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
So, first of all, and before we really establish this relationship between mating strategies and socio-political orientation, let's talk about each of them separately. So, sure. When it comes to mating strategies, what are the main, let's say, behaviors, preferences, strategies that fall under the rubric of mating strategies and that are the most relevant to this discussion?
Sure. So mating strategies, basically, before I describe the types of mating strategies, I will give a general definition of what mating strategies are. So they are the tactics that people use to find and retain mates. And from an evolutionary psychology perspective, they're basically considered adaptations that ultimately maximize reproductive success. So it is success in finding mates and reproducing. And of course, people not often consciously adopt a mating strategy to maximize the reproductive success, but we just assume that these are psychological adaptations that unconsciously often influence people to adopt certain behaviors, attitudes, and even cognitive processes to find and retain mates. And generally, especially in relation to my research, I think about mating strategies in a way that certain individuals fall on a spectrum, basically. And on one side, certain individuals adopt long-term mating strategies, for example, which means that people are more prone to form a long-term committed romantic relationships and be monogamous. And on the other side, other people might be more inclined to instead adopt short-term mating strategies, which means they're more inclined to have casual sex, short-term relationships, and in general, like sexual romantic relationships with many different people. In the human species, there's not one mating strategy that works best for everybody. People usually adopt mating strategies that work best for them, according to their own individual traits and also to the contexts, socio-ecological contexts that they live in. People not only each individual uses the mating strategy that works best for them, but also within each individual, they might switch their mating strategies according to the contexts that they're encountering. And also another way to think about mating strategy is sociosexual orientation. So people with a restricted sociosexual orientation are, let's say, they're opposed to casual sex. They're not comfortable with having casual sex themselves, and they're also against societal promiscuity, so other people having casual sex. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, people with an unrestricted sociosexual orientation are comfortable with having casual sex. They want to have many sexual relationships themselves and are also okay with other people around them having casual sex. So I hope that kind of answers your questions about what mating strategies are and the way that I've been conceptualizing them in my research.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that provides us with a good basis to start from. But now, what is then socio-political orientation?
So socio-political orientation is basically the beliefs and attitudes that people hold about certain social and political issues. And I mean, I'm sure in the political literature there might be other definitions, but in the way, again, that I have studied socio-political attitudes, I just, again, see socio-political orientation sort of as a spectrum. And on one side of the spectrum, there are people that have more progressive attitudes, and on the other side, people have more conservative attitudes. So when I use the term socio-political orientation, I usually just mean, again, the beliefs and attitudes that people hold about socio-political issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now explain then how do these two different things connect? I mean, mating strategies or preferred mating strategies and socio-political orientation. I mean, why is it that one would influence the other, or vice versa, if that's the case?
Yeah. So basically, my interest in the study of the relationship between mating strategies and socio-political orientation really started from reading basically the evolutionary psychology literature. And there are some papers, especially from researchers like Jason Whedon, Doug Kenrick, and Robert Kurzban, and I think Adam Cohen as well. One paper that they published in 2008, I believe, showed that people who have a more unrestricted sociosexual orientation are also those that are less likely to attend religious ceremonies often. So there was this connection between mating strategy, orientation, and religiosity. And after that paper, the same group of researchers basically showed with cross-sectional data, longitudinal data, and even experiments that it seems like that mating strategy orientation is what causes religiosity. So the general public often thinks that people are, for example, against casual sex, they want monogamy, and they are sexually restricted because they're religious. Like they learn from attending religious ceremony that you should be monogamous, that you should have a restricted sexual lifestyle. But there is evidence, I mean, I talked about the first paper, but over the next almost 15 years, there has been much more research showing that really the causal error, the causal arrow is in the opposite direction. So it seems like because people prefer monogamy and are against societal promiscuity, they embrace attitudes that are gonna discourage promiscuity, like religiosity in most cases, especially in the Western countries where Christianity is the main religious. Usually most of the core principles that they teach are also revolve around being monogamous and, for example, wait until marriage to have sex and so on and so forth. Of course, the reason mating strategies cannot explain all the variants of being religious. It's not the only explanation that is possible. But again, there seems to be like a lot of evidence now that people might adopt certain socio-political attitudes like being religious because they're trying to defend their mating interests, basically. And there is also, I should say, another paper that really influenced the research that then I did was by David Pinsov and Marty Asselton from UCLA. They also showed that people who are more sexually restricted are also more against gay marriage, for example, so to talk about something else other than religiosity. And they seem to be so, especially if they stereotype gay people as being sexually promiscuous. So basically, having read all this research, I was interested in in exploring this relationship between mating strategies and other socio-political attitudes more, and across several experiments, about 6 experiments, I consistently found that sociosexuality is significantly correlated with other sociopolitical dimensions. For example, I replicated the findings from Pinsof and Asselton and showed that sexually restricted people are more against gay rights than more sexually unrestricted people. I showed that sexually restricted people hold more sexist beliefs than sexually unrestricted people, in the sense that they're more inclined to view women, for example, to hold a role of mother and wives. So they're more traditional in the Western sense that we use that word, than sexually unrestricted people in gender roles, in terms of gender roles. And I also found some, although not very consistent and not strong evidence, that perhaps sexually unrestricted people are also a little bit more pro-social than sexually restricted people. Oh, I said it right. Sexually unrestricted, a little more pro-social than restricted people, in the sense that I found in one big experiment with over 1,000 participants that they were more in support of increasing the minimum wage and access to healthcare for everybody. But having said that, this is an important point, these results that I just talked about from my research were all correlational. So obviously I cannot prove causation from this data. It just seems that there is this, again, this correlation, that sociosexuality seems to, again, correlate with these other dimensions. But in these experiments, I was also kind of interested in seeing whether we could prove causation, in the sense that in a lot of the experiments I did, I manipulated mating circumstances, let's call it this way, the contexts that of the mating market that people are in, and see whether that would maybe influence socio-political attitudes. So maybe before I move on, I should just explain what I mean by mating market. So yes, basically, sure. Basically the mating market, just to define it up front, this is a term that biologists use and evolutionary psychologists. It's basically the social arena where men and women and individuals engage in sexual and romantic relationships. And biologists and again, anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists use the term market because in certain theories and interpretations of sexual relationships, sex can be considered a social exchange. So one individual gives sex to someone in exchange, for example, of resources, time, commitment, and other non-sexual resources. So there are many characteristics in the mating market that can be manipulated. For example, in one big experiment with over 200 participants, men and women, we basically had participants come into the lab and pretended they were going to participate in a dating experiment. And we manipulated how popular or unpopular they were with the opposite sex, basically. So it was quite a complex experimental setup, but participants came into the lab again and they were told to record a video of themselves, describing themselves, to participate in a dating game. And we told them, ostensibly, this wasn't true, but we told them that they would send this video to 5 people of the opposite sex. All the participants were heterosexual, just to simplify the study design. And that these 5 people of the opposite sex, who were all around their age, they were their peers, would send them back 1 video each with feedback, basically telling them whether they would date them or not. And so obviously participants were randomly assigned to either be very popular, so receiving all positive comments from these 5 peers of the opposite sex, or receiving negative feedback, like anything from getting all rejections to all positive responses. And what we found is, for example, for men, but not for women, men who received more rejections reported less support for casual sex than men who received more positive responses. So in this experiment, we showed that it seems that the mating feedback that people receive in the mating market can affect their mating strategies. So this one example of how we manipulated the mating conditions that people are in, and it seems that even like a short-term manipulation in the lab managed to kind of shift some attitudes towards casual sex. And this kind of fits in the literature that shows that men, more than women, are attuned to their mate value and to shifts in their mate value, and respond accordingly by shifting their mating strategies. And I should also say that this effect we found in men who self-rated their mate value before participating in the dating game as low or average, while people who self-perceived to have very high mate value were not affected by the feedback. So even if they got all rejections, it seemed like dating feedback doesn't affect the attitudes towards casual sex of those men that think they are popular nonetheless with people of the opposite sex.
Mm-hmm. But do you know if that effect is influenced by, for example, personality traits or socio-sexual orientation, for example?
So we controlled for self-perceived mate value in that case,
Okay.
not socio-sexual orientation, and we found a partial mediation via positive affect. So the men who received more rejections reported lower positive affects or lower positive emotions like happiness, pride, and so on. The men who received fewer rejections, and in turn, men with lower positive affect reported less support for casual sex than men with higher positive affect. So it seemed that receiving romantic rejections might curb men's enthusiasm and happiness, again, their positive emotions, and then in turn makes men more against casual sex. And of course, there have been other experiments that pretty much have also manipulated dating popularity, not in the exact same as our experiment, but in similar ways. And it seemed that it is a consistent finding that when men are rejected, they usually revert to a more opposition towards casual sex. And I think that even if we look at the outside world, I know that you've talked to both of my PhD supervisors, Rob Brooks and Candice Blake, right? You have interviewed them, and they have, for example, done a lot of work with Twitter and, for example, incels. So for those who might not be aware of who incels are, they call themselves involuntary celibate men. So it's an internet movement, we could say, of men that cannot find romantic partners. And so they usually express certain maybe misogynistic attitudes on the internet, and usually are against feminism or sexual liberalism and so on. And so it seems in this experiment that there is this tendency, or this causal effect that men were romantically rejected, then become more against more sexually permissive attitudes. This is just one example of the experimental manipulations I've used to show this relationship between mating market circumstances and socio-political attitudes. And I have to say that this was a small effect, and I'd be curious to see if people use different types of manipulations to measure simulate romantic rejection or acceptance, and if they replicate this effect, because I think it's just interesting to see how this mating feedback that we get actually then, impacts the way we see society and our attitudes towards our own sexuality and that of others. In another big experiment that is published in Adaptive Human Behavior and Physiology, we manipulated the quality of participants' mating competitors. So we told participants to enter their county. This was an online experiment. It wasn't in person. And we collected data from US participants. We told participants to enter their US county. And then we told them, we have collected data from people of your same age and sex that live in your county. And these are all their characteristics. And we manipulated either the physical characteristics of their same-sex peers, of participants' same-sex peers, or their incomes, to see whether having very attractive or very wealthy competitors would affect socio-political attitudes as well. And I should note that we didn't find a main effect, a direct effect of the manipulation, but we found that these primes of mating competitors, this information on the mating competitors affected participants' perceptions of their same-sex peers. So on average, the more attractive, for example, the physical characteristics of same-sex peers, the more on average participant rated them, perceived them to be more attractive. And in turn, perceiving your competitors more attractive made both men and women more supportive of traditional gender roles, such as that men should pay for dates, or women, for example, should take on roles of mothers and wives, these sort of dimensions. And same things for income. So the higher we told participants that their same-sex peers' incomes were, the wealthier they were perceived to be by participants, and that in turn also made participants more inclined to support traditional gender roles. And the idea is that perhaps when people perceive that their competitors are really formidable because they're very attractive or have very high incomes, then perhaps makes people want to uphold attitudes that make things more conservative, so that there is less competition on the mating market to acquire and retain mates.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's all very interesting. So perhaps these effects that you're talking about, I mean, exposing people to different cues coming from the mating market, from potential competitors and potential mates, I mean, those would be probably the reasons why people, in fact, care about the dominant mating strategies that are going around in their milieu, let's say, because, I mean, that could potentially improve or worsen their prospects in terms of, for example, if you're more conservative, finding a mate that is perhaps more monogamous and more interested in long-term relationships and things like that. And if you are more short-term oriented, and if you live in a more conservative place, perhaps it's harder for you to engage and have relationships with several different partners. I mean, that's the reason why people care about those sorts of things, right?
Sure. That's correct. The more or less, I just add like not a correction, but just to better explain this relationship between mating market cues and socio-political attitudes and mating strategies. It's more than, well, first of all, the data that I collected, I have to say, is mostly all from Western countries, where people more or less can choose the mating strategies that they want. There's a lot of freedom in that, more or less. So basically, people are attuned to changes in their mating market because they can choose the mating strategies that are more convenient for them, that eventually are going to maximize their reproductive success based on those mating market circumstances. So for example, let's say you're a man, and in the first experiment that I talked about, you might think that you have average mate value, so that usually allows you to compete for mates. So sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not. So you might have a mixed strategies, like maybe you're open to having short-term casual sex. But let's say that all of a sudden you try to approach many different mates and you receive a lot of rejections. That might shift your perceived mate value, and you might think that actually your mate value is lower than what you thought. So then you might shift your mating strategies accordingly and then become more against casual sex. You don't want to have casual sex yourself, and you're against other people having casual sex because you know it's going to be harder for you to find and retain a mate. And these are not like new concepts in evolutionary psychology. I mean, there's lots and lots of work showing that mate value, self-perceived mate value, is one of the traits that that can regulate basically people's socio-sexual orientation, that can influence their mating strategies. And a lot of evolutionary psychology, I mean, for example, it focuses on average sex differences, and it is like a cross-cultural finding that, for example, men on average, not all men against all women, but on average men are more open to casual sex usually than women are. But there is also a lot of within sex variation, and so that within sex variation is influenced by individual traits, and also it can be influenced by changing mating market circumstances. So these experiments that I just talked about was just ideas to test whether even just a short-term manipulation of this mating market condition can result in people shifting their attitudes to adapt basically to the changing mating circumstances, to do something that maximizes their mating interests and their and eventually their mating success. Yeah, I hope I'm not rambling too much and it all makes sense.
No, yes, it makes perfect sense. Yeah. So, but do factors like, for example, age and gender also influence people's political or political behavior in general?
Yeah, for sure. They all, like, there's so many individual factors, including sex, age, sex or gender, age, and socio-sexual orientation, for example. They all play a role. Regarding to gender, a lot of people try to basically, there's lots of literature that tries to understand whether it is men or women who are on average more conservative than the other gender. But through my research, and I mean also many other researchers have also found that it depends on the social political dimension that you're looking at. So again, I just talked to you about average sex differences in the preference for casual sex. So cross-culturally, men on average say self-report and are observed to have more casual sex in some cases than women. But what did I want to say? For other sociopolitical dimensions, is the opposite. For example, again, I was interested in people's attitudes towards traditional gender roles and certain sexist attitudes. Again, like there is this dimension called benevolent sexism. That's a form of sexism that is apparently benevolent towards women. For example, is ideas that men want to protect women, take care of women, but is a form of sexism because it still stereotypes women as the weaker sex, and the sex that needs to be taken care of, and so on. So I found in pretty much in all the experiments that I've measured this dimension that men are on average more into these traditional gender roles than women are, which I thought it was an interesting finding because it seems maybe very clearly men, like to some social psychologists or feminist thinkers, it's like clearly men are the more sexist sex. But there are also other social psychological theories like sexual economics theory that was proposing that in this mating market, women, for example, usually are the ones who exchange sex for resources more than men. And I'm not saying that that is always the case or that this theory is correct, but this theory basically proposed that women should prefer, on average, more than men, a society where sex is considered precious, so they can form long-term monogamous relationships and basically use sex to obtain commitment from men. So this theory technically should, from this theory, they would derive that that women more than men should then want a society that that wants these traditional gender roles where men take care and protect women. But throughout my study, I always found the opposite, that men more so than women self-report that we should have a society where women take on traditional motherly and wife roles, and men should pay for women for dates and protect and take care of women. And what do I want to do about that? That of course, like the way I've measured it is not through behavior or observation, is self-report. So of course, self-report can have bias. If people choose to not be truthful in the way that they answer questions, or maybe like social desirability biases, they respond in a way that they think would make them appear socially desirable, but it's not really what they think. However, a lot of the experiments I did were, completely anonymous, and most people responded to these questions in the privacy of their home. So you have to assume that more or less people are responding truthfully. Which actually brings me back to when we were talking about the experiments that I did. I should say that, again, all these attitudes that I measured were self-report measures and not behaviors. So again, there can be some bias in self-report measures. So it would be interesting to see in future research if people can manipulate these mating market cues and see whether that actually affects not only attitudes, but also behaviors.
Mm-hmm. And what explains things like the cultural suppression of female sexuality? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so I think that the phenomenon of the cultural suppression of female sexuality is very interesting because, again, there's this double standard that in a lot of society, usually women have to face negative consequences, stereotypes for engaging in casual sex more so than men. So it's really interesting to try and understand what might cause that. These double standards in general, but also why women's sexuality is so suppressed in some cases, and it's not okay. This idea that it's not okay for women to have sex with how many men they might want to. So again, a lot of theories focus on sex differences in the suppression of female sexuality. So for example, they want to ask, is it men who suppress the female sexuality more than women, or is it women that do so? And while on average, there might be sex differences in the extent to which people suppress female sexuality, there's tons and tons of research that shows that each sex participates in the suppression of female sexuality. So, for example, men might suppress the sexuality of their own mate because they want to have control and avoid control over their mates and avoid cheating, for example, and they want to have paternity certainty. So if they invest, for example, time and energy in their mates, they want to be sure that then their offspring are their own. And women might suppress the sexuality of other women as a sort of a competitive tactic because they want to retain their own mates, for example, in a mating sphere, or even like usually physical attractiveness, for example, gives many advantages over several spheres of society. So they might want to to compete. Basically, they suppress the sexuality of other women to compete with them and make sure they then don't lose mate and resources to these other women. But what I think it's interesting is that things are obviously more complicated than that. It's not just about men's and women's interests, but there are many other individual characteristics other than one's gender that can influence the suppression of female sexuality. For example, a very cool paper by Candice Blake, again, one of my PhD supervisors. She found that, I'm pretty sure this was in Tunisia. Mm-hmm. And she found that men on average support women's veiling, the veiling of women, more so than women do, but women with more sons support veiling more so than women with fewer sons. So if we interpret veiling as a way to kind of restrict women's freedom in that specific context, where and as a way to suppress women's sexuality, then it's not just gender that influences who wants veiling more, but it's also, for example, the gender of kin that might influence attitudes towards veiling. As another example, in countries where women economically depend on men, so in countries with high gender inequality, attitudes towards sexual permissiveness are more negative because men, for example, if they invest all these resources in their partners, they want to have paternity certainty. And also women who economically depend on their male partners might also want to make sure that they don't lose their partners. So the people are more against sexual permissive attitudes, But also, to use the same example, veiling, there is one paper, I think the lead author was Farid Padzoui. I hope that's how you pronounce their last name. And they also found that in areas that are more gender unequal, where women economically depend on their male partners, there is more support for religious veiling as well. So that's the way I've been looking at the cultural suppression of female sexuality, and I've been working on reviewing the evidence on the cultural suppression of female sexuality. I should say that that review paper is not published yet, so it's not been peer-reviewed, but just discussing what I found in the literature so far.
Mm-hmm. Right. So. I mean, regarding this relationship between mating strategies and socio-political orientation, there's just one aspect that I would like to ask you specifically about. I mean, we've already covered several different things here, but when it comes to same-sex rights or homosexual or gay rights, whatever you want to call it, why is it that that's one of the domains where preferred mating strategies manifests itself in terms of support or opposition to it? I mean, why would that be a big deal for people if there are people with a homosexual orientation that would be able to, I mean, get partners or marry or whatever?
So this is partly based again on work from David Pintsov and Marty Asselton, and also then my own research. There is this strong correlation between people's social sexuality and their attitudes towards same-sex rights, whereby people who are more sexually restricted are more against same-sex rights. And I think that the point you make is very valid. It's like, why would that be? Also, like, heterosexual people often compete on a different mating market than homosexual people, so they shouldn't even be bothered technically by what homosexual people do. And I agree with that point, in the sense that you make a good point. Why would that be? But in the way that Pintsov and Asselton made it, which I agree with, I think some people might have psychological adaptations that basically make them against what might interfere with their conservative sexual attitudes. So I think a lot of sexually restricted people perceive homosexuals to be against, the traditional marriage values. And some even, there's these stereotypes, especially for gay men, more than lesbian women, that gay men are promiscuous. And so even though these are not necessarily conscious processes, sexually restricted people might perceive homosexual people and gay men to be again promiscuous, and so it's against their own interests, and they cannot really, again, in these unconscious adaptive processes, distinguish between homosexual and heterosexual promiscuity. They're just against anything that is not in their conservative sexual interests, and so for this reason they're against same-sex rights. And of course, like, whether gay men are promiscuous or not, of course, this shouldn't, affect, like, people's attitudes. But I think that there is enough evidence to show that this seems to be the case. And again, like, this is not the only explanation for why people are against gay rights. There's, many other factors that go into that. But yeah, it seems like your social sexual orientation and how comfortable you are with casual sex and sexual permissiveness also influences your attitudes towards homosexuality.
Do you know if sex ratios also play a role here? I mean, in cases where there's many more women, or I mean, in this case, we have to look at things differently. It's the sex that is in the minority that usually dictates the rules of the mating market. So does that influence also people's preferred mating strategies and political values in this case?
Yes, absolutely. I think biased sex ratio is a huge characteristic of the mating market that influences people's attitudes and behaviors. And I mean, there's the seminal work by Gutentag and Seckert, and I hope I'm saying the last names correctly, that showed that when the sex ratio is male biased, so there are more men than women, usually things become more conservative. And men really invest in their partners, for example, and marriage rates are higher. When instead men are in the minority and the sex ratio is female biased, then things it becomes the opposite. Casual sex becomes more common, and there's less investment by men in the relationship, for example. And this is thought to be because, again, on average, men's preferred mating strategy is more so to have short-term relationships and casual sex, and women preferred mating strategies more to maintain long-term relationships and commitment. Again, this is just average differences. So of course, there are many women who engage in casual sex and want to do so, etc. But on average, there seems to be this gender difference. And so when women are in the minority, they, let's say, become the sex with the more bargaining power. So men adapt their mating strategy to match those of women a little bit more. And when men are in the minority, they have the higher power in sexual relationships, so to speak. And so women adapt their mating strategies to match men's mating strategies a little bit more. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it makes perfect sense. So just another question before we talk a little bit about your work on laughter. So do preferred mating strategies and cues people pick from the mating market also influence their political attitudes toward economic issues like wealth redistribution and stuff like that?
Yeah, so I maybe briefly mentioned it earlier in this conversation that I found some support, although was a little bit inconsistent, that people who self-reported that they were sexually unrestricted also, for example, reported more support for increasing the minimum wage and access to healthcare to everybody. And these are kind of the economic dimensions that I measured in my studies. And I also found in the first experiment that I did, there was a large online experiment with over 1,000 participants. In this experiment, again, we led participants to believe that they were in an online dating market. And we gave them a percentage of how popular they were with prospective mates and how big their mating market is, so how many ideal mates were available for them in this online environment. And I found an effect whereby people who had, I think, hundreds of mating opportunities were a little bit more self-reported, more support for increasing the minimum wage and access to healthcare, more so than people who were popular with just a few dozens. And people who were popular with thousands and thousands of potential mates. So this interesting kind of complex effect in a second experiment, which is the first experiment I talked about today, where participants came into the lab and they ostensibly participated in a dating game, I didn't find any direct effects of dating popularity, on how popular they were on these attitudes, but I found again that participants who were less popular, they reported lower positive affect, so less positive emotions than people who were more popular. And in turn, men who reported less positive emotions were also more against increasing the minimum wage and access to healthcare than people who reported higher positive affect, positive emotions. So there is some evidence that perhaps indirectly, and in the case of the first experiment, directly, mating market cues and mating strategies might influence these more economic, socio-political attitudes. But I think some of my findings were a bit inconsistent, or they weren't predicted a priori. So we need to further explore, I think, this relationship in future work. So yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, I know you did this work a while ago, but I still wanted to ask you a little bit about laughter. So, why did you study it, and what specifically did you study about it? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So I studied laughter. I'm not an expert, I should say, on laughter, but I had the chance to participate in two very cool cross-cultural projects on laughter. And this was all the way back when I was an undergraduate at UCLA with Dan Fessler. I would say the lead authors were interested in looking at laughter because laughter is a non-verbal form of vocalization of communication that can really kind of signal. It can be considered as a cue of affiliation between two people that laugh together. Mm-hmm. So it might have had a very important role in human societies and in human evolution to shape cooperation, right? So in the first project that I was part of, again, the focus was on co-laughter. So again, when two people laugh at the same time. And what we did was that basically we had participants listen to very, very short clips of two people, and this was from real conversation laughing together. And about half of these audio recordings, if I remember correctly, it was about half, were between friends, and the other half were between strangers. And people with pretty good accuracy, I think definitely over chance over 50%, I think it was like between 55ish and 60% accuracy, they could distinguish laughter between friends and laughter between strangers. So it seems that regardless of people's native language and culture, people are very good at detecting the affiliation in laughter. So it seems to be, again, cross-culturally, a pretty good signal of affiliation. And in the second project, people also listened to very short clips of laughter again. And in this case, the clips were recorded, I think, from female friends having conversations, and some of the laugh was spontaneous, and in some other clips the laugh was volitional. It was fake. It's fake laughing, basically, forced fake laugh. And again, people were very, very accurate cross-culturally across the world to guess which one was spontaneous, real laughter, and which one was fake laughter. Again, indicating that laughter might be a good signal of affiliation, and people are really good at perceiving.
Mm-hmm. Right. So Just before we go, would you
Yeah.
like to mention where people can find you and your work on the internet?
Sure. So right now I am working, as you mentioned at the beginning, the social neuroendocrinology lab at Nipissing University in Canada. We didn't get a chance to talk about it much, but I'm kind of integrating the study of testosterone or testosterone-influenced social attitudes in my work. I don't have we're working on a few publications, so hopefully that they'll come out soon, and maybe we'll have another chat about all that work. But sorry, I went into this long-winded spiral just to say that that's my current affiliation, and I don't have a website, something else I should be working on, but people can find me on Twitter, and my handle is at Francesca R. Lub, and also on Google Scholar you can find my work. It's just Francesca Luberti.
Okay, so thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, it's been great.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there, starting at $1. If you could, it would be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. You can also support me on PayPal. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Peregra Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whitting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hamel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazebski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litska, Denise Cook, Scott, Jackery Fish, and Tim Duffy. My producers is our web, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kandivets. Thank you for all.